Welcome back. The 1st of May marks International Workers' Day, a celebration of the rights of workers in many parts of the world. It was born out of violent clashes between police and protesters in Chicago back in 1886, an event which became a symbol for the struggle of workers' rights. But May Day is not recognised here in the US, which holds its own Labor Day in September. Benji Hire reports.
While much of the rest of the world embraces a Labor Day, in the US, this Monday is like any other. America's workers, employers and political leaders have had a checkered history on labour issues, with public sympathy for the rights of workers often divided along party lines. Unionisation in the US was at its peak in the 1950s, yet data from the Bureau of Labour Statistics shows union membership has since fallen to its lowest share on record. Only 1 in 10 American workers is now in a union. The decline in union membership rates contradicts a recent trend. Unions are enjoying their highest approval ratings in the US in decades, and a president who's proclaimed himself as leading the most pro-union administration in American history. Still, the number of non-union jobs outpaced the growth of union membership last year. That's largely because the most traditionally unionised sectors, industries like manufacturing, transportation, construction, represent an ever-shrinking share of the workforce. And various changes by lawmakers have also made it harder for unions to grow. Dozens of states have approved right-to-work laws, giving them the authority to determine whether workers can be required to join a labour union in order to keep their job. Some politicians are pushing back in a bid to expand workers' rights. Senators Bernie Sanders and fellow progressive Democrat Elizabeth Warren are trying to advance a bill to tax companies extra if found guilty of pay disparity. CEOs at the largest publicly traded firms are typically paid hundreds of times more than their median employees. Many citizens, though, aren't waiting for legislation. They're taking action into their own hands. Around the country last year, staff at hundreds of Starbucks stores voted to unionise, and thousands of gig economy workers launched a series of high-profile unionisation drives. Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, to name a few. Momentum is reaching mainstream audiences. Comedian John Oliver, in a segment last month, exposed how so-called essential workers on farms are not treated as their title might suggest. Then, just days ago, a judge ordered Tesla to stop violating employee rights after supervisors were found to have breached labour laws by telling them not to discuss salaries and conditions. It may not be Workers' Day stateside on May 1st, that comes in 4 months, but workers here are still charged up. Benji Hire, CGTN, Washington, D.C.
And in France, International Workers' Day has meant more mass protests in another display of anger over pension reforms. The pension age will raise from 62 to 64. It's a policy that has sparked months of social unrest. Natalie Malgus reports.
Protesters have been gathering since early afternoon for what the unions hope is the largest joint mass mobilization in Paris since 2009. For months, union leaders have rallied workers to come out and protest against the government's controversial and widely unpopular pension reform plans. Perrine Thomas is one of those workers who's been part of the rolling strikes. To lessen the financial impact, Perrine and her colleagues have been collecting donations to fund striking workers.
The precedent had been set with the CPE. This law was voted on by the president, but never applied. So the pressure that we put in the street might still work. We have hope. It is still possible, so that's why we're still protesting today. We have nothing to lose.
Last month, the Constitutional Council approved President Macron's policy changes to the pension system. The new laws are expected to come into effect by the start of September. But unions say this won't dampen their action.
Right now, we keep being asked to work 2 more years every time. Retirement keeps being pushed back, so it's hard for people my generation. I'm also here for my parents. We are seeing them working almost to death. So if we don't do it for ourselves, we have to do it for others.
Months of protesting has cost the state millions of dollars as workers in all industries have gone on strike. The aviation industry was once again affected by strike action on May 1st. The rail network all but ground to a halt. It's no coincidence that this day of major protest action is being held on a day deeply rooted in the fight for workers' rights.
Our hope is that more people join our protests so that there are fewer incidents of police brutality. Other than protesting, we don't have many non-violent options.
The mass crowds on the streets of Paris were just one of at least 300 protests taking place across France. Nathalie Malchas, CGTN, Paris.
And in South Korea, tens of thousands rallied for Labor Day, many calling for higher pay and improved working conditions. The protests marked the biggest May Day event since the start of the pandemic. Jack Barton has more from Seoul.
This is one of more than a dozen May Day rallies going on across South Korea involving workers and two of the largest union umbrella groups in the country calling for pushback against the government's labor policies.
The Korean government has suppressed the construction union, so we have come out to protect our right to live.
In March, President Yoon Suk-yeol was forced to back away from a plan to raise the maximum working week to 69 hours. That U-turn came after widespread protests. Many young South Koreans joined those protests and were quick to point out the obvious, that longer, more stressful working hours could have an impact on the country's birth rate, already among the lowest in the world and one of the country's biggest economic headaches. These signs say Yoon Suk-yeol out. South Korea's president bore the brunt of the protests.
Because the Yoon Suk-yeol government continues to suppress workers and trade unions, we have come out to show them that workers are here to fight against the government.
These demonstrators say the government is trying to make tough conditions even tougher. The last figures show that on average, South Koreans work about 1,915 hours a year. That is almost 200 hours more than the average for the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development and 566 hours more than German workers. It's not just long hours. These workers want higher wages and stronger rights in and out of the workplace. Labor Day is without doubt the biggest march like this of the year, but protests against the government's labor policies have been going on for months, and organizers say these protests, albeit on a smaller scale, will continue. Jack Barton, CGTN, Seoul.
For more on workers' rights, I'm joined now by Alex Soojung-Kim Pang. He's the Global Programs Director for 4-Day Week Global and an expert on reducing work hours. Thanks for joining us on the program today, Alex. Now, how would you describe the state of workers around the world? Of course, there are variations between countries, but have things changed over the last year, especially in the recovery period following the pandemic? And what do those shifts look like?
I think, you're exactly right that things have changed. I think that there were a couple big things that, are emerging in the wake of the pandemic, right? I think one of the most significant is the kind of rediscovery of collective action in the workplace, right? We've come out of a couple decades of the growth of gig economies and the sort of ideology that we are all micro-entrepreneurs. And I think that this is now giving way to a sensibility that recognizes that we can solve problems around, toxic workplaces or work-life balance or falling real wages much more effectively if we work together. But I think also the pandemic has opened up for employers and workers a sense that we can dramatically change how we work. That options that were considered impossible in early 2020 are now feasible. And so the challenge everywhere is to figure out what shape or what direction sort of those changes should take, and whether they're going to benefit all of us or just a few.
So are those sort of ideas, and is that philosophy actually a tangible benefit that people are actually reaping the rewards from? Are they getting better salaries? Are they getting better benefits, you know, even in the spite of things like inflation and a looming recession?
Certainly, people are fighting for them. I think that none of these changes come sort of very easily. But I do think that there are promising signs in things like the movement to shorten working hours, right? That there is a genuine interest on the part of some employers to sort of figure out how to make sort of work and sort of the rewards of it sort of better. And that, you know, we're seeing sort of unions or other movements sort of playing a constructive role in sort of helping to figure those things out.
Protests, of course, in France, again, they do love a protest. They've been denouncing Macron's pension reforms. Tell us about workers' rights in France and how much these protests will actually likely change things now that these reforms have already been implemented. I mean, Macron is fairly moderate, but he's also quite liberal. How do you balance the rights of workers with the need and necessity of ensuring the future of a country's economy?
Well, that's a terrific question, and I think that as often is the case in French politics, what starts off as potentially a small thing sort of turns into, sparks a much larger movement. And I think that, on both of these sides, Macron clearly sees this as an important part of his legacy, and opposition has little incentive to back down. So I think that these protests are not going to go away. But I think also that, when you move back a little bit, you realize that this is part of, a broader set of efforts to figure out what place work and labor ought to have in our lives in the 21st century. And that and that arguments over pensions are just part of this bigger debate about crafting policies, public policies that support people as they age and their desire to do meaningful work, to make contributions that are both economically valuable, but also give us that sense of satisfaction that work can often have. And so I think it's important to recognize that in France, this is a protest that's not against, it's not sort of pro-idleness, but rather it is anti-exploitation.
And what about layoffs, particularly here in the United States? Employment has been up since the recession. Is that still the case? And, with the talk of a looming recession, there are concerns that that's going to change. What industries are most at risk, and how worried should people be?
Well, here in Silicon Valley, I think the common assumption is that more layoffs are on the way. That lots of our biggest tech and financial companies expanded a lot in the last few years, and a huge amount of money also went to startups that were hired aggressively. And so more retrenchment feels inevitable. As for where else it'll happen, I think a lot of it depends on whether we, tip into a recession or not, whether the layoffs will become a more widespread thing in the United States.
Now, given that you are over in Silicon Valley, I wonder how AI and technology is impacting workers' opportunities. There's a lot of people that are concerned about their futures, depending on what, industry they're in, even in journalism, even in book writing, PR, that kind of thing. How should people think about their futures, their careers? Do they need to be concerned, or do they need to figure out how to adapt?
I think that the one thing that we all should do is not treat these technologies as having an inevitable kind of place in the workplace, or being used, or having their kind of own internal logic. What matters with AI and automation and robots is who controls them, who decides how they get deployed, and who owns the data that they use to learn and to do their jobs. So I think that if, for example, I'm a taxi driver and I train a self-driving car that I own, it can make my work better. But if someone else does that, then I'm out of a job. But I think that the good news is that tools like chatbots are getting cheap enough to be actually owned by office workers or people in professional services or writers. And the challenge is making it easier to train them so that they can competently support you to take on routine and repetitive tasks, rather than being things that are used by capital or to make your jobs and your work redundant.
Let's talk about the arts industry, given the fact that we've touched on writing. The TV Writers Guild, Film Writers Guild, I believe, in Hollywood are going on strike from 12 p.m. tonight. They're demanding better pay linked to the impact that streaming services are having on their jobs. How can the arts industry, particularly creatives like writers in Hollywood, better protect their jobs when technologies of all types are kind of zeroing in on what little they already have?
Mm-hmm. No, I think this is it's a great question, and it is very clear that the kind of original sin of streaming, whether music or movies or what have you, was that those rights were sold very, very cheaply, and that as a consequence, the bar has been set so low that that compensating content creators, writers, and so forth has become much more of a challenge than than it should, and that these creators are not necessarily people who can do things like develop ancillary services or auction off their scripts on eBay or something like this. And so fundamentally, I think it's going to come down to negotiating better terms that really recognize the value of their work and compensate it accordingly.
All right, Alex, really appreciate your time. Alex Soojung-Kim Pang there, Global Programs Director for 4 Day Week Global.
Thank you.